Good morning. This is part two, Being Shaped by Life, bearing witness from the book called Drinking from the River of Light, The Life of Expression. Bearing witness. The work of the poet is the name What is Holy, a task fit for eternity, or the small Eden of this hour. Diane Ackerman. Looking at life together. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. By James Baldwin. Bearing witness is one of the primary ways that human beings hold each other up and help each other grow. Bearing witness is also one of the primary functions of the art. Social media is becoming a modern form of bearing witness that is adding to a communal sense of art. In 2010, it was the viral use of Facebook that helped ignite the Arab Spring, a revolutionary wave of democratic protest and demonstrations that led to civil wars and oppressive societies in North Africa and Middle East. Here in America, the ability to citizens to film events in real time has led to an irrefutable bearing witness to excessive force by police. This all speaks to the timeless power of naming things for what they are in the open. Earlier, I mentioned the luminous poet Czesław Milosz. In 1981, Milosz was invited to give a series of talks at Harvard as part of ongoing Charles Eliot Norton Lectures. The talks were published a few years later as his remarkable book, The Witness of Poetry. In these deep and sweeping talks, Milosz articulates his belief that poetry should be a passionate pursuit of the real. He challenges us to reclaim the power of art to mirror both the failings and blessings of the world. He offers that art, in particular poetry, is an enduring crucible in which to face the moral challenges of our time. I would add that the chief function of art in all its forms is to marry what is with what it can be. By voicing the truth of things as they will and living our better angles, art helps us live. Gandhi valued poetry as an inner companion of his lifelong journey of activism. When journalists criticized his friend, the poet Rabindranath Tagore, as hiding in the poetry from the challenges that faced by India, Gandhi replied, I regard the poet as a sentinel warning against the approaching enemies called bigotry, lethargy, intolerance, ignorance, and inertia. Not only do artists and poets mirror our best and worst aspects, but they often are diagnosticians of the social body. The legendary blues musician Mose Allison tells the story of a prominent white educator who was studying the culture of the Hopi, the desert dwelling Native American tribe of the Southwest. He found it strange that almost all Hopi music was about water and asked one of the native musicians why. The old Hopi man put down his wooden flute and explained that so much of their music was about water because that was what they had the least of. And then he told the white man, most of your music is about love. This is another form of bearing witness, to uncover and mirror the weakening patterns of a society. Yet, a poet also stands an essential on the edge of the mystery, working as an inner explorer, trying to integrate the lessons of both the inner and outer world. We also bear witness when looking at life together. I have a friend who wrote me about the meaning of a poem I sent her. It really doesn't matter which poem or what it is, said. The reason I mention it is because, as the author, I don't have any advantage in uncovering its meaning. I just write them down. That is, retrieve them, trying to stay out of the way, trying not to corrupt what comes through with too many of my own preferences for meaning. The fact is that my interpretation is no more clear or relevant. than anyone else's. My friend's guess is as good as mine. It is really the conversations that arise from circling is retrieved that evoke the real poetry. In this, we are all poet fishermen, netting experience as we go and dumping what we catch and drag on board to look at it together. It makes me think of Jackson Pollock's method of painting, how he would let the brush hover over the canvas, not directly touching it, but letting the paint have the space to free fall and find its deeper flow. He wasn't just throwing paint, but giving an up his predeterminations of where the paint belonged. Instead, he entered a relationship with the unseeable space in between through which deeper patterns landed on the canvas. It is this interplay with the space in between the Martin and Buber speaks of as the place of true speech, the enliving of the I Tao, where the unrehearsed dialogue with God arises between two living centers. Letting go of our predeterminations and listening to the space in between is what allows the meaning of life to find its deeper expression through us. The poetry exists in that space in between the poet and the source, between life and our experience, and between the two or more who try to make sense of it. Every time we venture out in the world, we are both looking at life and bearing witness. It is how we keep current, how we keep the soul close to the surface without uprooting it from its home deep within us. I was recently sitting on a sunny afternoon in Washington Square Park in New York City when I realized that as much as I've learned from nature, I've learned even more from the human forest. I love the unrehearsed interplay of human beings, crisscrossing as we reach for light and love, bearing witness to each other. This one day there was a magician weaving his magic, while couples were lounging in the grass, and someone in the shade was hanging their head, while old men in the sun were playing chess. And at the head of the path, a trio of young musicians were lost in their jam, while a young man was bursting about with a sign that read, "Free hugs." We are here for such a short time, and the truth of our experience holds far greater stories than grandest fiction. The chief function of all art, in all its forms, is to marry what is with what can be, by voicing the truth of things as they are, while in living a better angels, art helps us live. The power of art. Here is a great truth, which is valid at every stage of quest. If you refuse or are not able to express, to make actual in some form or the other our vision, such at is at any point, then we are not only unable to go forward to the next step, but we are probably in for a regression. For instance, a dream or vision will retreat again into the unconsciousness and have no substance unless written or perhaps painted, made visible, audible, or tangible in some way, then shared with one another and attended to do so that it alters our attitude. By Helen Luke. One of the first readings I gave in New York City was at a bar in Greenwich Village. A crowd was assembling when a young man came in distraught and said, "I just saw a mugging on the way over here. I was so upset I stopped to write a poem." Somebody else bellowed from across the room, "Sure, beats stopping the mugging." This story illustrates how our modern sensibility has evolved to where we use our skills to separate ourselves from the life going on around us, to comment on it, while staying removed and protected. In this way, the words, the paint, even the music becomes a clear wall behind which we can see what's going on, yet not to be touched. But the courage to truly bear witness joins living things and empowers us to act on each other's behalf. This is the kind of bearing witness that yields art, that makes us the artist as whole, that offers healing to other living things. A touching example of bearing witness is the story of Pablo Neruda's memoirs when he goes to visit a mining site in Antofagasta, Chile. There, a man comes up from the bowels of the earth, his face completely caked. The miner reaches for the Neruda and calls him my brother, because his poems had affirmed the miner's life for years. This meant more to Neruda than the numerous awards and global renown he'd achieved. History is a cycle in which we are reduced again and again by suffering and conflict to the beauty and miracle of just being alive. The power of art enlivens this transformation. Gandhi said, the poet will sing the true note after the war is over, but there can be no art or poetry without expression and reciprocity to ignite true presence in the world. In 1978, NBC broadcast Holocaust, a television miniseries in 4 parts, directed by Marvin J. Chomsky, who also directed ABC's unprecedented miniseries. Roots, Holocaust, unfolds the story of a fictional family of German Jews as they are torn apart and dispersed throughout Europe and thrown into the camps. Though criticized by some, including Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, who described it as untrue and offensive. This flawed attempt to bear witness to this incomprehensible genocide stirred the conscience of the first post World War II generation in America and Europe. When shown in West Germany, the miniseries caused the next generation to explore their pain in remembering the Holocaust, which led them to question their parents and elders. How did this happen? How could it have happened here? Did you know about it? Did you have anything to do with it? The response to the broadcast was so strong in post war West Germany that the parliament extended the statute of limitations on Nazi war crimes. This is a dramatic example of how the power of art can reawaken our always needed conversation about what it means to be human and to live together. That the ministries were flawed only confirms that bearing witness can be done whether the art that stirs us in a masterpiece or not. It's more important to shout fire in a theater or murder in the square that sing on its pitch. In the wake of World War II, abstract expressionism from 1949 to 1960 was a global exploration by artists attempting to make sense of devastation, indignity, and ruin of a broken world. Things could no longer go on as they were, not as nations, not in education, not in our way of seeing or expressing who we were or what we've been through. The very means and manner of art began to break down and reform, taking another leap away from straightforward, literal representation of life into the world and energetic chaos of what on the surface seemed abstract, but which was creating portals for reflection on the realities of the dismantled world around us. In 1952, John Dufubet emerged as a leader in the European arm of this movement, which he termed art brut. In the same year, the French writer Michel Tapé published a book referring to abstract expressionism as un art auteur, art of another kind. As with all innovation, the curators of the day were slow to receive what was new. A few years earlier in 1950 in New York City, a movement arose when, in April of that year, at Studio 35, a group of 18 painters, including Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Barnett Newman, and Mark Rothko, and 10 sculptors joined together to protest a juried exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, claiming the museum was antagonistic to advanced art. As a result, the New York abstract expressionists were labeled the irascibles. At the same time, Montreal's avant garde movement, the Automaticists, boycotted a conservatively juried show at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, for which they were labeled as the rebels. Though the efforts of the irascibles and the rebels didn't change the stands of the museums, their steadfastness solidified a worldwide movement in abstract art that is now, almost 70 years later, foundational to our time and the centerpiece of these museums. Again, we are shown that staying true to who we are and gathering our presence authentically is a compelling and nonviolent means of social change. In indigenous cultures, poets have always been the ones to carry the tribe's history, its joys and traumas. That sacred role has been resuscitated and muffled in modern times. The performance artist Marina Abramovic has assumed that the role for her native Yugoslavia for much of her life. Abramovic was born in Belgrade in what was Yugoslavia in 1946. The daughter of strict military heroes who had prominent positions in the Tito's post war government. When people ask me where I'm from, she says, I never say Serbia. I always say I come from a country that no longer exists. As happens throughout history, a worn torn land produces a global timeless citizens whose voice belongs to no one but speaks for everyone. In 1997, she bore witness to the suffering for her native country by performing Balkan Baroque in the Venice Biennale. This piece involved her scrubbing clean 1,500 cow bones 6 hours a day for 4 days and weeping as she sang songs and told stories from her native country. The power of art remains dormant until we experiences, as Helen Luke says, made visible, audible, and tangible in some way. Then, shared with one another and attended to do that, it alters our attitude. The first step in realizing the power of art is to see things as they are and to dare to give voice to what we see, expressing what life is doing to us and through us. Paradoxically, giving voice to the truth of any situation liberates us, even when we feel powerless. The dissident Russian writer Alexander spent his life fighting for human rights. Among his books, he wrote Prussian Nights, a book length poem based on his experience as a captain of artillery battery on the Belarusian front, which invaded East Prussia at the end of the World War II. This is the story of how he wrote that book. In July 1945, Solzhenitsyn was sentenced to an 8-year term in a forced labor camp to silence his voice. During his imprisonment, he composed all 12,000 lines of the poem, writing a few lines each day on a bar of his soap, memorizing them as his daily shower washed the lines away. Later, he wrote how expressing this poem, composing it line by line, helped him survive his imprisonment. I needed clear head before for 2 years. I write a poem, a most rewarding poem that helped me not to notice what was being done to my body. Sometimes, while standing in a column of dejected prisoners, amidst the shouts of guard with machine guns, I felt such a rush of rhymes and images that I seemed to be overhead. At such moments, I was both free and happy. Some prisoners tried to escape by smashing a car through the barbed wire. For me, there was no barbed wire. The head count of prisoners remained unchanged, but I actually was away on a distant flight. Once free, he slowly penned the poem that he was memorized while he was in prison. In 1969, he made a recording of Prussian Nights. His integrity and work became known worldwide, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970 for the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. Finally, Prussian Nights was published in a Russian edition in Paris in 1974 after he was expelled from his beloved Russia. This is yet another compelling example of how giving voice to the truth in an inner form of breathing, which, like focused meditation, can help us endure the harshest circumstances. In her essay Poetry and Commitment, Adrienne Rich tells this more recent story. On July 17, 2005, the San Francisco Chronicle ran this headline: Writing poetry was the bomb that kept Guantanamo prisoner from going mad. The story recounted about how Abdul Rahim Muslim Dost, who was arrested in Afghanistan and held without charges in Guantanamo, wrote thousands of lines of poetry during his detention, scratching line after line with his fingernail into styrofoam cups. When we rely on the integrity of our heart to carry us, our ability to endure is strengthened, regardless of what it is created. The act of expressing is a release of life force that keeps creating us. Giving voice to the truth of any situation liberates us, even when we feel powerless. Drifting in the immensity. As the sky is reflected in water, the world is reflected in the immensity we call the inner world. We are citizens of both, seekers of both, looking for peace in both. While we take aim at goals and destinations in the outer world, a deeper part of us and drift in the immensity of life like a fish hypnotized by the current that carries us. When carried in the inner world, we bear witness to the light and depth and impenetrable oneness of things. I had to mentor a teacher, a friend, who was a great witness to the light and great student of the unseeable immensity. He was Joel Elks, a watercolorist and a doctor, a remarkable human being who died in 2015 at the age of 102. After being educated in Lithuania and Switzerland, Joel was sent by his parents to London to study medicine while they endured the Holocaust in England. He embarked on a career that would establish him as one of the founding fathers of psychopharmacology during this time. He began inquire into the divine universals that inform life. This led him to the practice of art, where he followed the reflection of the world into the realm of soul. The trail of that inquiry in this paintings. If you live long enough, life erodes us to a perfect opening. This describes Joel Elks and all that he did. Through his open heart called immense love, through his open mind came immense understanding, and through his opened eyes came immense paintings, which belong in the lineage of those compelled by light. In this tribe of seers, the subject, whether a water lily, a field of barley, or a sunflower, becomes an occasion by which all of life makes itself known briefly. For Joel, the subject was often bark or stone, or water, or patches of sky, all occasions to witness and feel the irrepressible play of light. When asked about his paintings, he said, "These paintings are all statements of wordless within, for light is stronger than rock." One of the Joel's earlier paintings is called Big Sky, Little Boat, and for a man whose vision and heart can ran deeper than words, this small canvas says a great deal. For each life is such a little boat drifting in the immensity, each heart and eye listening for how the sky and ocean speak to each other. Over the years, I've learned that the closer I am to that depth, the less I have to fuse with the words. When I can be authentic, I'm much more closer to the source of all being. The farther I stray from that center, the less accurate I am in what I say, and more complicated my language becomes. When it all seems refracted and unclear, it's a sign that I have to go back to the original vision and try again, more directly in a more heartfelt way. This is the true meaning of revision, not the economic pruning of language. Being with Joel, listening to Joel, and loving Joel deepened my understanding of what it meant to be a poet. Working Joel led me to this poem. To be a poet, we are nothing but shores laying ourselves before the clear depth of all that is, letting it wash over us. In this, we are forever translators not through our minds or by how we conjugate verbs, but by living openly on the edge. If you want to be a poet, you must first want to be. If you want to see God, you must first want to see. If you want to be of use in the endless dance of growing into the dying and dying into growing, become a shore and, against all likelihood, your voice will rise like gulls that ride the waves. And what is compassion but drifting in the immensity of life with an open heart? We bump into the past and by so many torn and budding lives along the way. Some are like us, many are not. But under it all, we stored the same ounce of spirit carried in skin and bone. One of our jobs, then, is to learn how to relate to cascade of others who rise and fall around us. The practice of compassion is how we learn that we are each other, and the practice of expression is how the heart knows itself. I was recently at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City thinking of all this when I sat before Van Gogh's Wheat Filled with Cypresses, painted in 1889. I first saw this with my dear friend Robert in 1994 when we were both newly awakened. Me on the other side of cancer and Robert on the other side of alcoholism. It still moves me. What Van Gogh did in this canvas was to render the elements beneath their solidity, revealing the space where everything is fluid, where air, fire, earth, and water are interchangeable. Like a quantum physicist, this driven artist conjured the elemental place where everything touches everything else. It is the place Robert and I were reduced to it, our own suffering, the place where beauty lives under all its disguises. And 25 years later, I had returned to find that this ever changing canvas, where the skies rise like the sea and the earth is on fire, this bare essential landscape is still a mirror of life force that fills us. As I sat there, this painting I so loved seemed an x ray of our human soul. The others wandering in the museum knew this to be true. I could tell by how they stopped when they came upon it. No one said a word, but I could hear the wave of fire washing in their sky, all of us bits of life force erupting in place. I could have put a frame around the nearest stranger and hung them on the wall, and they would have been a testament to all we go through and never share. Artists like Joel and Van Gogh are bearing witness in the fundamental way. Like a keen biologist, the deeper artist within us bears witness, not to the events that trail behind us, but to what leaves and lives beneath the skin. The practice of compassion is how we learn that we are each other, and the practice of expression is how the heart knows itself. Thank you. To be continued.